Shooting from over the weekend. It happened Friday night on Linwood Avenue in the city's Hayti section. Police say as 32-year-old Labreya Street was found there with a gunshot wound. Police say she later died on the scene. Police have now charged 51-year-old Montgomery Davis with murder and possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. He is being held without bond.
On a warm Sunday afternoon, the kind that carries the sound of children's laughter across quiet streets, the Street family gathered inside a modest Montgomery home. It was the kind of setting that should have been filled with comfort, the aroma of home-cooked food in the air, familiar voices echoing down the hallway. But that day, there was no peace in the walls of this house. Instead, the conversation had shifted to something deeply personal, something that touched the very core of what Labreya Street lived for, her son. Labreya was 32 years old, a mother who had built her world around her little boy. Every decision, every sacrifice, every long day of work was for him. Friends would say she had a way of looking at her child like nothing else in the world mattered. And that was the truth. But for months, the whispers and arguments over who should have a say in raising him had been growing louder. Her uncle, a man who had once held her as a baby, who had watched her grow, had begun to challenge her in ways she never imagined. To outsiders, it might have seemed like a family disagreement that would pass. But for those in the room, the words being exchanged were sharp, personal, and cutting deeper with every sentence. It started with raised voices. His tone was firm, hers was unwavering. She wasn't about to give in, not when it came to her son. Every moment they went back and forth, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. The child, too young to understand the complexity of what was happening, stood nearby, watching his mother's face, perhaps sensing the tension but unable to grasp where it was leading. The argument moved through familiar points, questions about decisions she'd made, challenges to her ability to provide, accusations she refused to accept. Labreya stood her ground, the same way she always had when protecting her boy. But what no one could have expected was how quickly words would turn into something irreversible. Then it happened. A sound that would split the day in two, the sharp crack of a gunshot. For a heartbeat, silence followed. And then came another. In that brief moment, Labreya's life was stolen from her, her body collapsing to the floor while her son's eyes remained locked on her. The voices that had filled the room only moments earlier were replaced with the chaos of panic, screams, and the realization of what had just been done. The young boy stood frozen. His mother, the person who had been his constant, his safety, was lying still. The man who pulled the trigger was someone who shared their blood. The lines between family and enemy were gone, replaced with a reality too brutal for a child to comprehend. Outside, neighbors began to emerge, drawn by the sound of gunfire. Some hesitated, unsure if they should approach. Others ran toward the house, calling out her name. And in those first few minutes after the shots, the world around that home changed forever. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a fracture in a family that could never be repaired. Police would arrive within minutes, but for the boy, those minutes were an eternity. The flashing lights, the rush of voices, the strangers in uniform stepping into the home, all of it was a blur. But the one thing that would remain crystal clear in his mind was the sight of his mother on the floor, and the knowledge that she was never coming back. This was the moment where the fight over custody, a battle of words, had crossed into the unthinkable. It wasn't a stranger or an intruder who had taken her away. It was her own uncle. And as officers began piecing together the sequence of events, the painful truth began to settle over everyone who loved her. The argument that ended Labreya Street's life was about the very person she died protecting. Every family has its disagreements, its tensions. But on that day in Montgomery, those tensions didn't just end a conversation. They ended a life. And in doing so, they left a child without the one person who had fought for him with everything she had. The kind of loss that cannot be explained, only felt, for the rest of his life. This is the story of a mother's love, a family's breaking point, and the devastating moment when blood ties meant nothing in the face of violence. This is the Labreya Street story. Labreya Street was more than a name on a police report. She was a mother, a sister, a friend, and a daughter whose life was rooted in love and responsibility. Born and raised in Montgomery, she carried the kind of reputation that followed her into every room, the woman who showed up when you called, the one who remembered birthdays, the one who would work late nights if it meant her son could have a better life. People who knew her described her as warm but strong, patient but unyielding when it came to protecting what was hers. Her life hadn't been easy, but she carried herself with a quiet dignity that made others believe in her. She had become a mother at a young age, and that role transformed her. She poured herself into raising her son, keeping him safe from the kinds of struggles she had known growing up. Each morning before work, she would check his homework, pack his lunch, and offer the same encouraging smile. Those moments were ordinary to anyone else, but for her, they were the foundation of her purpose. Every sacrifice she made, every bill paid late so he could have what he needed for school, every extra shift at work, was for him. She was determined that her boy would know stability, even if she had to carry the weight alone. Family had always been central in her life. Holidays were spent together, meals were shared, and advice, wanted or not, was often given. But with closeness came disagreements. Her uncle was a part of that same family circle. To those on the outside, he was a man who carried himself with authority, often speaking his mind without hesitation. Within the family, he had a history of stepping into matters he believed needed his input, whether his opinion was invited or not. Over time, that tendency had caused strain between them. What began as differences over parenting decisions grew into open disputes. The topic was always the same: her son. Her uncle believed he had a say in how the boy should be raised, questioning choices she made and implying she couldn't handle the responsibility alone. To Labreya, these comments were more than frustrating, they felt like an attack on her ability to be a mother. Friends would later say that she had confided in them about her worries, that she feared the arguments might one day become more than words. In the weeks leading up to that Sunday, their exchanges became more frequent. There were phone calls that ended abruptly, text messages that carried a sharper tone. Family members, sensing the rising tension, tried to step in, suggesting they sit down together to find common ground. But pride, hurt, and the deep conviction each held about what was best for the boy stood in the way of resolution. The idea of custody, who should be responsible for him, became the center of the conflict, a wound that no conversation seemed able to heal. Labreya's friends knew she was stressed. She still went to work, still cared for her son, still laughed when the moment allowed, but there was a weight in her voice. She had begun to worry about the long-term impact of the conflict, not just on her but on the child who was caught in the middle. Yet, no matter how difficult the situation became, she refused to walk away from the fight to keep him with her. For her, giving up was never an option. Her uncle, meanwhile, spoke to other family members about his own frustrations. He believed he was right, that his vision for the boy's future was the one that should be followed. When asked why he couldn't simply let her raise her own child, he would insist that he was only looking out for the boy's well-being. But the conviction in his words was matched by the unwillingness to compromise.
We have uncovered some new troubling information about a deadly shooting in Durham. It all lined out in the search warrants that we got a hold of. The murder happened more than a month ago when a woman was shot in front of her 7-year-old son. WRL's Monica Casey has learned the victim was related to the suspect.
Montgomery Davis is charged with second-degree murder and possession of a firearm by a felon. Right now, he's being held here in the Durham County Detention Facility. Police say he fled the scene after the shooting happened, tossing that gun out the window. This is 32-year-old Labreya Street, who died in late June. According to her obituary and a GoFundMe page, she graduated from Jordan High School and leaves behind a son. That 7-year-old saw his mother die outside this home on Linwood Avenue, according to newly released search warrants. Street's uncle, Montgomery Davis, is charged in her death, telling police when she fell to the ground, he knew, quote, his life was over. According to warrants, Davis told police this started when Street was intoxicated at a family party and wanted to take her son home. Davis claims he took Street's son back to his house after the two argued in the road, where he says they both slapped each other. He says when he got home, Street came inside and chased him around with a knife, putting her child back in her own car. Davis told police when Street continued to threaten him with the knife, he pulled out a handgun from his truck, pointing it at Street to, quote, scare her. The warrants say police spoke with Street's son, who told them, quote, Uncle Montgomery shot my mommy. Davis claims he didn't know the gun was loaded and he didn't know it would go off. Davis was given no bond because of the severity of his charges. His next court date is set for September. Reporting in Durham, Monica Casey, WREL News.
On the morning of that Sunday, there was no sign that the day would end in violence. The house where it happened had seen its share of family gatherings. It had been a place where birthdays were celebrated, where children ran down the hall laughing, where the smell of Sunday dinner lingered for hours. But that day, the house would become the setting for something that no one in the family would ever be able to forget. The conversation began like so many before it, with frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. Voices rose, and the disagreement over custody returned to the forefront. Each word felt heavier than the last, each sentence a challenge. It wasn't the first time the boy had been present during their arguments, but this one carried an edge that was sharper than any before. And while the child stood close, trying to follow what was happening, the two adults remained locked on each other, unwilling to back down. Witnesses later recalled hearing the argument from outside, words punctuated by silence, then more shouting. What no one could predict was how quickly it would shift from an exchange of words to an irreversible act of violence. And when it did, it happened in seconds, a flash of movement, the deafening sound of gunfire, and the moment Labreya's body hit the floor. Those seconds ended one life, shattered another, and left a child standing in the center of a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The home, once a place of family connection, had become the site of a crime so personal it defied comprehension. From that moment forward, nothing would be the same. For the Street family, the loss was more than the absence of a loved one. It was the knowledge that the person responsible shared their name, their bloodline, and their history. And for a little boy who had just lost his mother, the world had become an unfamiliar place, one where the person he loved most was gone, and the man who took her away was someone he had once been told to trust. This is where the tragedy of Labreya Street begins to reveal its deepest wound, a family broken from within, and a love for a child that became the spark for an unthinkable act. From the moment the first officers arrived on the scene, the quiet street that had been lined with parked cars and shaded by old trees was transformed into something unrecognizable. Patrol vehicles formed a blockade near the curb, their flashing lights bouncing off nearby houses, painting the neighborhood in alternating bursts of red and blue. Neighbors, still in their weekend clothes, stood on porches and sidewalks, speaking in low voices, their eyes fixed on the small home where moments earlier, life had been ripped apart. Inside, the air felt heavy, thick with the sharp scent of gunpowder that clung to the walls. A trail of hurried footsteps marked the living room floor, a reminder of the chaos that had erupted. The officers' radios crackled with clipped voices, urgent updates, calls for backup, instructions to secure the area. Every movement was deliberate. They moved past the kitchen, past framed photographs of family gatherings that now felt like relics from another world, until they reached the center of the room where Labreya lay. The lead officer stopped, taking in the scene without speaking. In his years on the force, he had seen violence before, but there was something about this one that clung to the air. The child, too young to understand the legal weight of what had happened, sat on a couch, his small frame trembling, his eyes fixed on a point on the floor as if staring too long at anything else would make it real. A female officer crouched beside him, speaking softly, though her voice could not disguise the urgency of the moment. She asked him questions, her tone careful, as if trying not to shatter what little sense of safety he still had. At the far end of the room, the suspect, her uncle, was standing, flanked by two officers. His expression was unreadable. His hands, once steady, were now cuffed in front of him, his wrists bound in cold steel. He wasn't shouting, wasn't struggling. Instead, he stood in a rigid stillness, as though the weight of what he had done was pressing down on him in real time. One officer read him his rights in a firm, measured voice, but the man's gaze wandered past the officer, landing briefly on the boy before shifting away. Outside, detectives began arriving, their unmarked cars pulling in behind the patrol units. They stepped out, adjusting the badges on their belts, their eyes narrowing as they surveyed the scene. The street had become a stage for speculation, and every face in the crowd seemed to carry a question: why would a man take the life of his own niece? What could possibly push family to cross that line? Crime scene tape was strung across the yard, its bright yellow color cutting sharply against the fading afternoon light. The wind made it flicker and twist, its movement drawing attention to the boundary it created, a line between those who could still go home and those whose lives had just changed forever. Inside that boundary, evidence technicians began their work. A camera clicked in slow, methodical bursts, capturing angles of the living room, the position of the body, the shell casings that rested like cold markers of violence. Each piece of evidence was photographed, measured, and marked, the scene frozen in time for the investigation that was now underway. As the investigation unfolded in those first hours, the story began to take shape in fragments. Witnesses spoke quietly to officers, their words carried away by the hum of radios and the distant noise of neighbors still trying to process what had happened. Some had heard raised voices before the gunfire. Others had only heard the shots, followed by silence. A few spoke about the tension between Labreya and her uncle, though none could have imagined it ending this way. The child was taken from the house, escorted gently by an officer who shielded him from the crowd. The boy's small hand clung to hers as they walked toward the waiting car. His face remained expressionless, but his grip tightened with each step, as though letting go might make the last moments with his mother fade faster. Back inside, detectives turned to the suspect. His voice was calm but deliberate as he gave his version of events. He spoke about disagreements, about what he believed was best for the boy, about how he thought he was stepping in to help. But there was an undercurrent in his words, a tone that hinted at something deeper, years of unresolved resentment, perhaps, or a belief so fixed in his mind that no argument could have shaken it. When pressed about the moment he pulled the trigger, he avoided direct answers, his eyes shifting to the floor, his jaw tightening with each question. The hours passed, and the once busy home grew still. The evidence was collected, the photographs taken, the scene mapped out in meticulous detail. Outside, the crowd began to thin as darkness settled over the neighborhood, though a few remained, unwilling to leave until the last police vehicle pulled away. Somewhere in that fading light, the weight of the day began to sink in, the realization that the family's pain was only just beginning. For the detectives, the case was no longer just about gathering facts. It had become about understanding how a dispute over a child could end in murder. It was about piecing together the chain of decisions, words, and actions that led to the trigger being pulled. And for the boy, the reality was cruelly simple: the two people who had been central to this chapter of his life were now gone. One lay still inside the home. The other was being driven away in the back of a police car, his wrists still bound, his future as uncertain as the boy's own. That night, as the last camera flash faded and the tape was taken down, the home was left in silence. But that silence was different from the one before the gunfire. This was the silence of absence, the kind that lingers in the walls, that echoes in the spaces where voices used to be. And it would stay, long after the case moved into courtrooms and headlines, long after the police files were closed. This was no longer just a custody dispute. It had become a story of loss, of blood turned against blood, of a moment where the very idea of family was shattered beyond repair. The trial began under the weight of an entire community's grief. From the moment the courthouse doors opened, the air inside felt dense with expectation. Rows of wooden benches filled quickly, family members on both sides, friends of Labreya, members of the public, and reporters scribbling notes for the evening broadcast. The shuffle of feet and low murmur of voices gave way to silence when the bailiff called the court to order. At the prosecution's table sat a team who had spent months reconstructing every moment leading up to the killing. Their files were thick with photographs, witness statements, transcripts of interviews, and the grainy, haunting still images from the crime scene. Across the room, the defense appeared calm, their client dressed neatly in a suit that hung loosely on him, his expression controlled but his eyes flickering from the judge to the jury, then occasionally toward the gallery, though never for long. The prosecution began with a simple, devastating statement: this was not an accident. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a choice. Their opening remarks carried the jurors back to that Sunday afternoon, painting the scene in careful detail: the heated exchange, the gun, the child in the room, the life that ended in seconds. They spoke of motive, of a custody dispute that had stretched on too long, of a man unwilling to accept that the law and the boy's own mother had the final say. Witnesses were called one by one. A neighbor who had heard the argument described the sound of voices rising, then the unmistakable sharpness of gunfire. An officer recounted the moment he stepped into the house, his voice steady but his eyes fixed on the floor as he recalled seeing the boy sitting silently on the couch. A crime scene technician explained how the weapon was found, loaded and resting only a few steps from where Labreya's body lay. But it was when the medical examiner took the stand that the courtroom seemed to tighten. He spoke with precision, detailing the injuries in a tone that was clinical yet undeniably heavy. The photographs shown to the jury were difficult to look at. Family members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some wiping tears, others staring straight ahead, refusing to break. The child was spared from being present, but his absence was felt in the way every person in that room seemed to glance at the empty chair where he might have been. The defense countered with a narrative that attempted to cast doubt on intent. They argued that emotions had clouded judgment, that the shooting was the result of a moment of overwhelming frustration rather than a calculated act. They spoke of years of family disputes, of personal stress, of decisions made in seconds that could not be taken back. Their client, they said, was not a cold-blooded killer, but a man whose relationship with his niece had been complicated, tangled in years of unresolved tension. Still, the prosecution pressed harder. They produced text messages from weeks before the shooting, messages in which the accused expressed anger over custody, frustration toward Labreya, and a belief that she was making choices that would ruin the boy's future. They pointed to the fact that he had the firearm in his possession that day, that it was loaded, and that in the seconds before it was fired, he had the opportunity to walk away but chose not to. One of the most gut-wrenching moments came when the jury was shown a short video clip, recorded inadvertently on a neighbor's home security camera. Though it captured no faces clearly, the audio was unmistakable: muffled shouting, the boy's voice calling out, the shots, and then a sudden, hollow silence. The sound seemed to grip the room, pulling every person present into that living room on that afternoon. Days of testimony stretched into weeks, and the tension in the courtroom only grew. The jury listened, their expressions carefully guarded but their attention unwavering. Each side fought for control of the narrative, the prosecution anchoring its case in the permanence of death, the defense trying to place it in the chaos of a single, emotional moment. When the accused finally took the stand, the room leaned forward. His voice was low, measured, but at times faltered under the weight of cross-examination. He admitted to pulling the trigger but insisted it had been without thought, that it was a flash of emotion he could not take back. The prosecution pressed him, asking why he had brought the gun in the first place, why he had pointed it, why he had fired twice. Each question was met with hesitation, the kind that leaves an answer hanging in the air, half-formed and unsatisfying. Closing arguments brought the case to its sharpest point. The prosecution's voice carried through the room, measured yet unrelenting. They reminded the jury of the boy's presence, of the trust between family members that had been broken in an instant, of the choice that ended Labreya's life. They asked for justice not just for her, but for the child who would grow up with the memory of that day forever etched into him. The defense urged the jury to see a man, not a monster. They painted him as flawed, misguided, overwhelmed, but not beyond redemption. They spoke of the irreversible nature of the act and the lifetime of regret their client would carry, suggesting that mercy had a place even in a case like this. When the jury retired to deliberate, the air in the courtroom seemed to still. Hours passed. Each time the door opened, the gallery tensed, waiting for the announcement. And then, as the evening shadows began to stretch across the courthouse steps, the jury returned. The foreperson stood, hands steady but voice firm, as the verdict was read. The words echoed, final and undeniable. And with them came a wave of reaction, quiet sobs from one side of the gallery, silence and lowered heads on the other. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp and heavy, marking the end of the trial. But for those who had lived through the loss, the end of the trial was not the end of the story. In that moment, the courtroom became more than a place of law. It became the final arena where the truth was laid bare. Where a family's deepest fracture was named, judged, and recorded for history. And for the boy, though absent from that room, the decision would shape the rest of his life. The sentencing hearing drew almost as many people as the trial itself. By then, the weight of the verdict had settled in, but there was still one final chapter for the court to write. On that morning, the hallways of the courthouse filled early, relatives on both sides, attorneys, and members of the public who had followed the case from the beginning. The echo of shoes on the polished floor mixed with hushed conversations, each voice carrying its own emotion, grief, anger, resignation. When the accused was led in, dressed in the plain clothing of the county jail, he avoided eye contact with the gallery. His hands were cuffed, his posture stiff, his face more drawn than it had been during the trial. There was no longer a jury to persuade, no strategy left to play. The only thing left between him and the rest of his life was the judge's decision. The prosecution spoke first. They did not repeat the evidence that had already been laid bare in court. Instead, they spoke about the cost. They talked about the boy's future, about how no sentence could give him back what he had lost. They described the long road ahead for a child who had not only lost his mother but had also witnessed the act that took her away. They read statements from those closest to Labreya, voices filled with sorrow and exhaustion. When her mother stood to speak, the courtroom fell silent. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. She spoke of the daughter she had raised, the young woman who had fought through every hardship for the sake of her child. She talked about birthdays missed, the empty chair at family gatherings, the way the house felt colder without her laughter. She looked directly at the man in shackles and asked a question she knew could never be answered. Why he had chosen violence over love. The defense asked the court for leniency. They spoke of remorse, of the weight their client would carry until his final days. They admitted nothing could undo the harm but argued that the law's harshest punishment would not bring healing. When it was his turn to address the court, the man stood and turned toward the judge. His voice was quiet, his words brief. He said he wished he could take it back, that he thought of it every day. But he did not turn to face the family. He did not look at the boy, who was kept away from the proceedings for his own protection. The judge, having listened to both sides, spoke in measured tones. He acknowledged the tragedy of the case, the irreparable harm to the family, and the duty of the court to ensure justice. His words built steadily, deliberate and unhurried, until they reached the moment everyone had been waiting for. The sentence was long. Decades that would outlast the man's youth, ensuring that he would spend most, if not all, of his remaining years behind bars. The gavel came down, and with it, the last legal decision in the case was sealed. But justice in a courtroom is different from healing in real life. In the months that followed, the aftermath spread far beyond the courthouse walls. The boy went to live with relatives who did their best to shield him from the constant replay of events in the media. He had nightmares at first, sudden wakes in the middle of the night, clinging to the blankets as if they could keep the memories out. Counselors worked with him, slowly, carefully, trying to help him separate the present from that day in the living room. For Labreya's family, grief settled in like an unwelcome tenant, always present, shifting from sharp pain to a dull ache that never fully faded. They kept her photographs on the walls, her favorite coffee mug in the kitchen, the scent of her perfume lingering faintly in her mother's home. Birthdays were the hardest. Each year, they would gather, light a candle, and speak her name aloud. They wanted her son to grow up knowing exactly who she was, the mother who had fought for him until her last breath. The community, too, was left with a scar. People who had known both Labreya and her uncle found themselves struggling with the duality of loss, grieving for her while trying to reconcile the man they once shared meals with, now a convicted killer. Conversations about the case often ended in long silences, the kind where words failed because no explanation could make sense of it. In the prison where he served his sentence, the man settled into the rhythm of time measured in counts and locked doors. He wrote letters occasionally, to the court, to clergy, sometimes to extended family. But whether those letters carried truth or simply a bid for connection was something only their recipients could decide. None reached the boy. As years passed, the legal case faded from headlines, replaced by newer stories. But for those tied to it, the memory stayed sharp. The house where it happened changed owners, the walls painted over, the furniture replaced, but some neighbors swore that certain evenings still carried an echo of that day. The boy grew older, carrying pieces of his mother's spirit with him, her determination, her way of standing firm when it mattered. Those who raised him spoke often about her, making sure her story wasn't reduced to just the way she died. They told him about the way she laughed, the way she celebrated his small victories, the way she believed in him when no one else did. The boy grew older, carrying pieces of his mother's spirit with him, her determination, her way of standing firm when it mattered. Those who raised him spoke often about her, making sure her story wasn't reduced to just the way she died. They told him about the way she laughed, the way she celebrated his small victories, the way she believed in him when no one else did. In the end, the aftermath was not about the man in prison or the sentence he served. It was about the life she had lived, the people who loved her, and the boy who would grow into a man carrying the weight of her story, not as a shadow, but as a testament to her unwavering devotion. If this story moved you, if the life of Labreya Street, a loving mother whose only dream was to protect her child, touched you in any way, then let her story be more than just another headline. Let it be a reminder that behind every news report is a real person, with a voice, a heart, and a family who will forever feel the weight of this loss. Share her story. Talk about it with the people you love. If you ever see tension building within a family, especially where children are involved, step in, seek help, and don't wait until emotions boil past the point of reason.